John McGreevey was born in Muncie, Indiana, which earned a certain fame, not because of John McGreevey, but because it was researched by a group of sociologists and labeled Middletown, USA. So I was born in Middletown, for what that's worth. We didn't stay there very long, actually. My father was a restless sort, and he had the idea that he could be a gentleman farmer, and so we moved from Muncie to outside a little town called Red Key, Indiana, and he was going to make a small but comfortable fortune raising frying chickens. Well, it was 4 happy years for me, living on a farm and having that kind of freedom that one has. He did not make a comfortable fortune out of frying chickens, and we quickly moved on. And by this time, the Depression was in full force, and my memory mostly is of preparing to move from one place to another. However, a stabilizing effect in my life had already been established in that I was trying to write. My father was a semi-invalid by choice, and so he was home, and he taught me at home, so that I learned to read and write by the time I was 4, and by the time I was 7, I had written my first play, which did not win a Pulitzer Prize. But I forced my poor sisters to appear in it. It was a deathless saga about the Easter Bunny, and I think we charged safety pins to get in. We didn't have a long run. The grosses were disappointing. But that was the first time that I remember the theater, the excitement. We had a rigged up curtain, had a blanket. I have no idea where this interest in the theater and the drama came from. There's nothing in the immediate family backgrounds to account for this. My grandfather on one side was a lawyer, and on the other a farmer, and I guess it's partly the Celtic inheritance, being Irish. But that was my first play, and then really with some regularity I started writing plays from then on. And after the farm life in Red Key, I was sent to live with my great aunts in Logansport, Indiana, which was a little town of about 18,000. But they had a wonderful library. And I think this is one of the big influences in my writing life. They must have had about, I'd say, 150 or 200 plays in the library, and I read every one at least once over the course of several years. In high school, they skipped me. I was 3 years ahead of myself, which I would not recommend to anybody. But I graduated from grade school when I was 11 and was in high school then at 11. I had a wonderful English teacher who found out that I loved the theater and drama and encouraged me. And one of the assignments in class was to read Thomas Hardy's Three Strangers, which is a wonderful short story of his. And I dramatized it, and she staged it with a very reluctant group of classmates. But that was another stepping stone. And then I thought, hey, this is great, seeing them up there saying things that I've written. And my senior year, I wrote 2 musical reviews. One for the debate squad, of which I was a member. We needed money, and so I wrote the debate squad Follies of 1938, and stole music from all the best, Gershwin, Rodgers and Hart, rewrote the lyrics, of course.
Of course.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hart and Ira. And I was the whole schmear. I played the lead. I'd written it, I directed it. If it was produced at all, I produced it, I guess. And then our yearbook was called The Tattler. We raised $72, incidentally, for traveling expenses for the debate squad. Then our yearbook was called The Tattler. and they needed some money. Remember, we're still in the Depression. And so I wrote the Tatler Review of 1938. Once you get a catchy title, you know, you just change certain elements. And the wonderful teacher who taught drama at the school came up to me afterwards and said, "John McGreevey, you should be hung." And I said, "Miss Hartz, how can you say that?" And she said, "That is the worst instance of scene stealing I have ever seen in my life." This leads me to another important thought, I think, in terms of the writing. I never thought I was going to be a great actor, but I did a lot of acting in high school and college, and worked in the community theater later. And I think it had a very positive effect on then my writing, because if you're up there saying the lines, and when I was freelancing at home, our son used to, I think, charge admission. Anyway, he would bring his little friends in when they were about 4 or 5 and stand in the doorway when I was writing, because I did all the lines. It was a one-man performance, actually the best performance. But I do think that the experience of not just being a writer, but of being someone who's in the position of taking someone else's lines and trying to make them work was very, very helpful to me. Luckily, I did have good grades, and I got a scholarship to Indiana University. And also, I say this, in 1998, the tuition at that point was $37.50, and I mean $37.50 per semester. But that $65 was a lot of money. And so, or 75, I guess it would have been. Anyway, I did get a scholarship and went to Indiana University and was an English major with my parents' idea that I would teach English sometime, you know, some security there. But for me, it was a chance to be in the theater, and I think the whole time I was there, I worked in some function, at some job, on every production that they had. Initially, I tried out for every play. I obviously didn't get into any of them, I think, in my freshman year. Well, I think by the end of the freshman year I was cast. But I worked backstage, I worked on the sets, I was property manager, I was prompter, and I think all this fed into the fact that I wanted to be a writer and create things that could be done in this atmosphere, and I was aware of the limitations of other people's crafts and the importance of them too. And Indiana University was wonderful for many reasons. The background in theater that it gave me. I played it very safe. I also had a minor in journalism and a minor in advertising.
You covered all the bases.
I covered all the bases, and but I think probably my biggest debt to Indiana University is that's where I met my wife, who was a very fine actress and director, and anyway, that
Nota?
Nota, N-O-T-A.
Beautiful name.
And married to a writer, everybody always says, where does that name come from? And you know, in almost 54 years, I've never come up with a story to explain the name of Nota.
You have never come up with a story on
No.
that. I find that hard to believe.
Isn't that terrible? Where do you get your ideas? Anyway, I was, fortunately, I guess, or fate, I had eye problems, and I was rejected in the draft. I was 4F, and I had no money coming out of school. I had gotten into radio. They had a small radio department at Indiana University, and I'd started writing radio plays actually when I was on campus. So I wasn't in service. I needed a job, and the head of the radio department had connections in Indianapolis, and he got me, and men were scarce in those days. He got me a job at WIRE in Indianapolis. I lasted less than a week. I was fired by Eugene Pulliam and his wife in a very kindly way. I had come out of the university and I was totally unprepared for commercial radio, where they expected me to run my own turntables, and I never played a commercial at the right speed in a whole week. I never did. And so Mr. Pulliam said, go and God bless. And fortunately, and I think this is very important too, I'm used to rejection, and I had another job in less than a week in Evansville at more money, and I didn't have to do the turntables.
Perfect.
And had a great deal of freedom there, and that's when I really got into writing for radio. I did a series based on Poe's short stories and aired it on one of the stations that I worked for there, which was a great experience. Again, I wrote and produced. I didn't appear. By that time, I was a little self-conscious about trying to be Orson Welles. But again, it was marvelous training. In my so-called spare time, I kept sending in scripts to freelance radio markets, and also to amateur theater catalogs. And my first sale, as I say, I was 25 years old, and I actually got a check for a one-act Christmas play from Dramatic Publishing, and I knew, you know, it was a turning point. It's a really very surprising, psychologically, the difference in your attitude when you're a non-selling writer and are getting nothing but rejections, and you make that first sale and you think, oh, maybe I'm not crazy. Here's somebody else at least that
It's a
thinks.
nice confirmation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's, and then that was the beginning. I made the amateur play sale, and they said, we'd like to see more of your things, and they bought, I'd say probably over the course of 3 or 4 years, they bought a dozen one-act and three-act amateur plays from me, about 4 or 5 of which are still in the catalog, and I get a small royalty check twice a year. But at the same time, it seemed to unlock radio, and I started selling freelance radio scripts. Developing your own imagination and relying upon the imagination of the audience. If I give them certain clues, they will, sound mostly, they will then do a set far beyond anything that we could afford to build if we were, and it was not an easy transition really from radio to television. And I was very fortunate to have worked in the theater as well as radio. But radio, I think, is, most writers feel that, who worked in it, it's the greatest medium, because you're not limited. You don't have to think in terms of production. The transition from radio to television was into live television, which was very, very much like theater. I mean, writers were treated as like playwrights. We actually were invited to rehearsals, and we were the ones who made the changes in the scripts. And in that regard, live was a marvelous medium for the writer. And then the next step was film, and that I've had some good times there too, but the writer is at a whole different level still in film work. They didn't arbitrarily change lines. You actually met the actors and actresses, and if they had a problem with a line, you were the one that they talked it over with, and you made the adjustment. Hollywood was in the throes, in a state of flux, because the studios were having to accept the fact that television was not just a passing fad, and what was it going to do to theatrical releases, and was everybody going to stay home and watch TV? And the impulse in many areas in this town was, how can we kill television before it kills us? They had the luxury of choosing in 1 week from 9 dramatic original shows, hour shows, on the 3 networks. Kraft Theater and Philco and Studio One and Robert Montgomery Presents, and it was really paradise. I realized that my radio income was slightly drying up, and this was like 1950, and there was a publication called Writer's Digest, which I think is still published, and they carried occasionally articles about writing for radio, television, the screen, and actually gave some market listings. So I watched Lights Out, which was one of the pioneer shows, and I thought, I can do that. And so I wrote a script and mailed it in blind, no agent. I never had an agent in radio. So I mailed it in, they bought it. And so I got to know some of the people there, and I did 4 more Lights Out scripts, 3 or 4 more. And also I'd been writing radio scripts for Armstrong, and they were easing into television with a show called Theater of Today. No, that was the radio show, Circle Theater. And so they said, why don't you try your hand at a TV show? And I did, and they bought it. And then I found a short story that I liked very much in a collection of Penguin New Writing. It was written by a Welshman named Sid Chaplin, related, but not the Sid Chaplin who was an actor. It was called Bread, and it was a story of miners in Wales. And there's a cave-in, and these 2 men are trapped together, and the one has bread in his lunch pail and doesn't tell the other man that he has it. So I thought, I get goosebumps thinking about it. So I thought, there's a television show here. So I wrote the author of the short story and said, I'd like to try to make this into a TV hour show. How about it? And he said, go for it. And he said, in one of the best throwaway lines in the world, and incidentally, I'm represented by William Morris over there, and if they can be of any help to you, please feel free to call upon them. So I did the adaptation and got the original writer's blessing. He loved it, and I sent it to William Morris, and they liked it and sold it to Philco and asked if they could represent me. Also, my agent said, look, this is not radio. You cannot stay in Phoenix, Arizona, which is where all this was happening. You sat in Phoenix and wrote your radio scripts and nobody cared. But if you're going to write for television, you've got to either be in New York, preferably at that time, or the West Coast. So we picked up and moved to New York, and had 2.5 wonderful years back there before, from there being 9 one-hour drama shows a week, there was 1. Studio One was the only one left, and the cry was, go west, young man, go west, because that's where it was going to be. The moguls said, why are we spending all this money on these shows that we could never run again? Why don't we put them on film? And well, if we're going to put them on film, we shouldn't be in New York, we should be on the West Coast. And I had had a really bad time making the transition when suddenly there were no live shows, freelance live shows left, and my radio had dried up totally, and I actually said, I've got to get a job. Well, a sort of writing job. There was a blind ad in the New York Times. We lived in New Milford, Connecticut at that time. And so I got on the train and went into New York and met this guy in a hotel room there. And he was from Prudential Insurance. And what they were looking for was somebody to write the house letter and do incidental chores, writing chores around the shop. But I had, by that time, we had 3 children and fuel oil bills that I couldn't pay, and it was $11,000 a year, guaranteed security. And so we had the interview, and at the end of the interview, he said, "The job's yours. I don't know why you want it with your background." So I had the security of the job, and in the meantime, a friend said, "You know, MCA is looking for writers to go to the West Coast because MCA is developing a production arm of its own called Review Productions." And I went, they said, "Why don't you check? Have your agent check." And so I did. And they said, "Come in." "Sure, come in." And one of the men who made the biggest difference in my writing life was Bill Morwood, who had been a story editor on Robert Montgomery Presents and had worked around town in various writing and non-writing capacities. And MCA had given him this job of looking for some writers who could go to the West Coast and turn out material. And Bill he had glasses like Coke bottles. I mean, he could hardly see. And they had put him in what looked like a rejected closet. There was actually a cord hanging down from the ceiling with a bare light bulb in it. And I thought, oh boy, what am I getting into here? Prudential Insurance is looking better and better.
You're supposed to take a big leap here, right?
Right.
Okay.
And so he said, what a wonderful man. He said, they're looking for suspense stories, and they're not paying big money, but they are really hungry. And so he said, "Have you got anything like that?" And I said, "Well, now when you say stories, how much do you need?" And he said, "Oh, half a page." So I said, "Okay, let me work on that." And I went back out to New Milford and did 3 half-page stories and sent them to Bill. And he put them in the pouch, the overnight pouch, and they went to Hollywood. And they said, "When can McGreevey come out here?" And so I flew out and was chained to a desk at at MCA Review, which then they were in that beautiful building in Beverly Hills, which they called the Ice Palace. It was all, I don't know what's there now, but I worked. I was out here without my family. My family was back in New Milford, and so I worked. I couldn't believe it, because anything I turned out, they bought it. And so I went back and said to my wife, "We love Connecticut and we love New York, but we don't have to pay fuel bills out there."
Yeah, really.
And I've got
the work
work.
is there.
Yeah.
Now, when you were writing for Craft and Review and all of those, how did you keep up that writing pace?
Well, there was a question addressed to me by you or Angela as to how much I liked writing, or do I like writing. It's like asking me, do I like to breathe? I never seemed, in that period, I get tired now, but when I was younger, a 12-hour day was not unusual. And because I loved doing it, and I was just into it.
But I mean, you know, looking at the dates on things that you wrote, some were movies of the week, some was episodic television. There would be 3 to 4 a month there, and then I'm looking at all the ones that were not produced. How could a person have so many ideas?
Well, I want to be generous about that. I had ideas, but also, as you know, in the television business especially, producers have ideas, and even network people have ideas occasionally. And I was given a lot of some of the best ideas. That was more after I had established myself.
But the difference is that those people can't execute them.
No, that's it. But it still becomes theirs. They can still speak of it as my so-and-so, as you may or may not have noticed. But I never had any problem with the episodic. They were all my ideas. And I never had any problem. Of course, My Three Sons and Family Affair coincided with our own families growing up. And we didn't have three sons, but we had one who almost compensated for the other two. And we had two daughters, which was a nice mix. And a lot of ideas for the family comedy series came out of our own family life.
Because the dynamics are the same.
Exactly.
Really. And we related to those. I mean, we watched Family Affair and Nanny and the Professor and My Three Sons. I mean, everybody could relate to those. How do you think Hollywood is different, and even television now, from those days?
Well, I think we're talking about comedy now, and I think comedy is very much tied in to where the culture is at that particular point in time. It's not only comedy either, now that I think about it, because I had the privilege of working on the Waltons a lot, and the Waltons succeeded partly because it came along at a time when we'd just gotten through the Vietnam War, and families were disintegrating, and we were accused of being totally selfish, et cetera, and to have a Depression family that really cared about each other and actually sat down and talked over things and didn't watch television instead of communicating with one another. The timing it reflected where we as a society were, and I think comedy is the same thing. If Seinfeld had come on in the 60s, nobody would have known what to do with it. I think I was saying to someone earlier, I had the privilege of working with a director-producer named Peter Tewksbury, and he should have lived to work in the 90s, because that's the kind of work he was trying to do in television in the 60s.
He was just more ahead of his time.
He was ahead of his time. But I think that the family comedies that I worked for in the 60s were very reflective of where we were as a society, the ones that succeeded. And My Three Sons was on for 13 years, so they must have been doing something right.
I think we needed the Waltons too, because that show was so family oriented, but it didn't necessarily hit you over the head with the message. The show was the message, even though at the end we all understood that there was an inherent message in there. It was so beautifully done that the characters were interesting.
Yes, the chemistry in that cast was really amazing. To have that many people, and that was something of a headache for a writer when you had 7 children and grandma and grandpa and mom and pop and the 2 old ladies and the storekeeper and his wife, that you really should try to shoehorn in someplace in every 48-minute, that is an hour episode. But they were rich, and you could feature 1 or 2 and keep the others in the background.
Now, did you decide which ones you would feature each week, or was there a rotation of sorts?
Well, I don't recall it ever affecting me in story presentation. They did have some of the actors and actresses for 6 out of 13, or rather than for every one. I had the pleasure of introducing the storekeeper's wife. She's my character. I created her. And also Verdi Grant, the black woman. I suddenly stopped after we had been on almost a year and said, wait a minute, isn't this Virginia where we are? And we haven't seen a black face yet.
But nobody had ever brought that up.
No. And so I said, I'd like to do a show about a black woman who is illiterate, a strong and wonderful person, but she's never learned to read and write, and she's faced with a crisis because she sent her daughter to college in New York, and the daughter is going to graduate and wants her mother to be there, and she couldn't even sign the register at a hotel. And so John Boy teaches her to read and write, and that was an Emmy. And Verdi was one of the most important continuing characters then, and of course Cora Beth.
It's Cora Beth, yeah. I love. I mean,
was
she
the
was
acid,
the woman
the acid
you love
in
to
the
hate.
Waltons, yeah.
How do you think the writer's role has changed from then to now?
Well, as I said a little bit when we were talking about live TV, I think because it was related to theater, the writer had a lot more respect and was treated less as an employee who did a certain thing and then you got rid of him and the real people took over. I still think there's far too much of that in film. The writer shoved aside, or it's forgotten who really made all this happen, which is not to denigrate the role of the director or the actors or anybody else, but I don't think we still have achieved the kind of position that we deserve considering our contributions. In television, it's even worse. I think we have even less prestige and consideration. And what infuriates me, I think, as much as anything, is that often in reviews, a script will be, a telefilm will be praised as having this quality and that quality, which is so extraordinary, et cetera, and who is not mentioned? The writer at all. And this is by another writer. That's what really bugs me, is that here's a writer ignoring the writer.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I have written a lot of docudramas, so I've been dealing with real people. And in that case, I spend a lot of time researching. One of my pet projects, which never got made, was Thomas Jefferson. I did 6 hours, and I spent about a year in research and writing on that particular project, which is very unusual for me. But if you're dealing with someone who actually existed, that's very impertinent of you to begin with, and I think you need to be as enmeshed as you can get in their thought processes, if you can, if they're diaries or letters or the interior kind of thing, rather than just the external biographies or even autobiographies, which are often not as revealing as a diary or letters.
Do your characters talk to you? I mean, do you sit there?
Oh, yes, and talk back, and if they don't, then something's wrong. If I don't hear them and it doesn't sound good, and I know somewhere I don't have the character yet. And sometimes I don't know that until I've done a first draft, and I realize that it's not right. It's me talking rather than the person. But that's what rewrites are for.
And so sometimes reality must get in your way at times and be distracting.
Oh,
and we've
you
kind
mean
of
the
talked
reality
about
of their lives, yeah. Yeah. Having been involved in a major lawsuit, I'm very cautious and tried to get my producers and the networks to be cautious. They pretty much are now. But taking liberties with living people, the best thing I ever wrote was Judge Horton and the Scottsboro Boys. And some of the boys were still alive. Judge Horton was not. A minor character who had been a deputy sheriff was still alive. And we had been assured that both the women, there were 2 women involved in that case who were prostitutes, who accused the 9 black boys of having raped them when they hadn't. And we were assured that both of them were safely dead. And the morning after it appeared on NBC, their lawyers of both of them contacted NBC and said, "We're suing you for $6 million. This was 1976, so $6 million was still a lot of money in those days. And it actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. The lower court found in our favor. The appeals court found in our favor. And then they took it on to the Supreme Court, and by that time the insurance company said, we can't afford to spend any money, and so they made a a pittance settlement, which really made me very angry because we shouldn't have settled. We were within our rights, and
I think that happens a lot just because out of sheer monetary value, and it's too bad because basically it's the principle that's at stake.
Exactly. But anyway, to go back to the springboard for this, yes, I'm very careful, and of course now there have been enough suits that the networks are extremely cautious, and sometimes extra cautious, I think, maybe too hyper cautious, and you lose some beautiful scenes, but they won't take the risk, and they're probably right.
Now, on your docudramas, you know, Hiroshima, even this Patty Duke story, Call Me Anna, Annette Funicello's story, the Unabomber, those are all heavy subjects. How did those affect you when you were working on them?
Oh, the Unabomber was so depressing. I wanted to do it because in a strange way I could relate to him, because he was pushed ahead in school the same as I was. He was trying to please his parents rather than making a life for himself. But oh, what a downer. I mean, in the long run it was very good for me to do it, because I thought, well, thank God I got out. I didn't close off myself as he did, and that was my salvation.
I'm sure a lot of writers clamored for that project. What was the what is the process now that you're involved in, as opposed, we know what the early days were like, how different they were. What's the process like now?
Well, they came to me, and I was very uncertain about it, to tell you the truth, because, you know, this is before the trial, and are we finding out someone guilty before he goes to trial? And so in the script, I really leant over backwards. We told it primarily from the point of view of the brother, who to me is the real, almost more tragic than the Unabomber, having to make the decision. And the script didn't say he is guilty. I mean, there is a lot of evidence here, but it was quite an experience too, because it was shot on a shoestring, and they were up in Utah, and I was on the phone all the time with changes, and we had to be very careful about. This is something, again, not bad-mouthing directors, but sometimes when directors get on location, they get inspired, and the inspiration runs counter to what we know is legally possible. And this happened several times. Fortunately, I had someone up there who was aware of this problem, and we were able to handle it, but it was quite an experience.
It's amazing to me that you write in so many different genres. How do you do that?
Well, that's another, if I had advice to give, and someone who would listen to me, besides you, I would say that unless you want it, don't allow yourself to be typecast. When I came out having written, I was a New York writer, which was highly amusing since I was born in Indiana and lived 9 years in Arizona, but I came out as a New York writer, and known chiefly for suspense things that I'd done on such TV shows as The Web and Danger, and then I worked on Climax, which was a wonderful live show out here.
Was that CBS?
Yes, I did 12 of those. So I was a suspense writer. Then there was the big Western boom, and I'd lived 9 years in Arizona. I'd written 400 radio shows called Arizona Adventure, and it seemed to me there ought to be some place for me in the Western boom, and my agent succeeded in convincing Hal Hudson, who was sort of the kingpin at 4-Star in those days, to give me a chance. And then I became a Western writer. And I know that particular genre hurt a lot of people. I know a number of writers who never got out from under being Western writers. And I had kept saying in a small voice to my agent, you know, I wrote a lot of comedy for radio. I wrote a lot of comedy. I think I could write comedy. And you're not a comedy writer. So I had written a script for Studio One, which was a comedy called The McTaggart Succession. And so when we went on strike in 1960, there were very few production companies that we weren't striking. And one of them was Don Feddersen, who had signed a favored nations thing and said, whatever is decided, I'll pay it. Send me, because he was just starting My Three Sons. And so Sylvia sent, my agent, Sylvia Hirsch, sent the Studio One script to Peter Tewksbury, who was the producer-director of the first year of My Three Sons, and he liked it. And suddenly I was a comedy writer. And I wrote about 35 episodes of My Three Sons, I guess, 30 or 35, and then moved on to another Feddersen show, Family Affair, and The Smith Family with Henry Fonda, and To Rome with Love. And then I went to Screen Gems and did Hazel and Gidget and all those wonderful things with Harry Ackerman. Every Family Affair I wrote, we said something. It was not, you know, and we didn't hit people over the head with it. It was implied usually. And if they wanted to infer it, great. If they didn't, if they just wanted to laugh at Mr. French, then that was their prerogative. So then I was a comedy writer, but then I went back to Westerns and did a lot of Wagon Trains, which was concurrent. And in those days, when I was doing episodic, I did between 16 and 20 shows a year. I usually had a commitment from Feddersen for 6 to 8, and then Wagon Train I'd do 4, and et cetera.
But you were considered a freelancer, though.
Oh yeah, I was always, the only time I was not freelancing was Black Saddle, which was a show that I had created, and I served as story editor on that, and it was the most frustrating experience I've ever had in my life. But I tried hard, but I just obviously was not able to communicate to other writers what we were looking for. When I first came out, my agent also got me some feature assignments. I have done feature pictures. But when I think of the size of the audience, and the shows that I'm most proud of would never have been made as feature movies. Judge Horton and the Scottsboro Boys, the Helen Keller, The Miracle Continues.
Miracle, right.
Those, and we reached millions and millions of people, and I'm very happy being a television writer, even though we were considered second-class citizens.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel? The fact is that through the shows that you've worked on in the movies of the week and the things that the docudramas, you've shaped really people's reaction to social issues and people's true stories. I mean, I don't want to sound trite, but how does that make you feel? It makes me feel very good. The Scottsboro Boys, for instance, one of the 9 had escaped from prison and assumed another identity and had lived for 20 years a lie. And as a result of the show, he came forward and went to Alabama, and the wonderful Governor Wallace gave him a full pardon. Well, you know, that's that's not bad. And then it's very gratifying. I did a movie based on a book called Simple Justice, which really was a story of desegregating the schools, and Thurgood Marshall was the hero. And fortunately, he got to see it before he died. He was very cooperative, and he watched it, and there was a long silence as the lights came up, and he said, "Well, you got some of it right," which I thought was a very nice tribute. And an even nicer one was when he died just a few weeks later, at his memorial service at St. John's in New York. They showed 10 minutes of our film at his memorial service. And then I did Consenting Adults, and the mail that we had from troubled, you know, a lot of people in Hollywood said,
you're way behind the times. You know, being gay is no big deal now. Why are you playing this up? That was true on the two coasts, but in between, being gay was a hell of a big deal, and to show an ordinary family coping with it or trying to, the mail that we got as a result just broke my heart, but made me very proud that I'd been a part of it.
When you're adapting somebody else's piece, how do you know what changes to make? What do you look for?
Well, sometimes very popular works in prose, the idea is great, maybe the characters, some of them are marvelous, but it's just not very filmic. And my job, I feel, is to keep as much of the material that interested the buyer in the first place and that made this a classic or a bestseller or whatever. Keep whatever you can, but don't be so locked into it that you forget that what you're writing is a film, which is very different from a book. One of the first, I was telling you about writing, doing my writing as a young person. I fell in love with a book called The Gentle Persuasion by Jessamine West. Now, this was long before the movie, and I wrote to Miss West in care of her publishers and said, "Hey, you're very lucky, Miss West. I'm John McGreevey that you never heard of, and I decided I'd like to adapt your book for the stage." Well, she wrote me a lovely letter and said, "Fine, I'll give you a 6-month option, and I'll be looking forward to seeing what you can do." And I had a wonderful time with it, and sent it to her, and she turned it over to her agent. But I was much too loyal to the source. I was too respectful of her genre, and didn't make it dramatic. I didn't make it a theater piece. It was just a collection of her stories put on the stage, but not drawn together in a theatrical and dramatic kind of way.
Well, I'm sure it's difficult to take a writer, you know, you've adapted Poe. I mean, all of the things from the beginning, I would think it would be difficult to not only the intimidation factor, but the respect factor. The fact that you love their work so much that you want to be a part of it, I would think would enter in greatly, almost to the point of interference.
It does. Now, the most recent adaptation I did was Captain's Courageous, which I think is one of the best things I ever did. I have the utmost respect for Kipling as a storyteller, but I was much truer to his book than MGM was when Spencer Tracy won the Academy Award. The character that they made for Tracy is a bit part in the book, but Tracy was under contract and it was a big box office star, and of course we're going to make a vehicle for him. Why shouldn't we? And I took liberties because it was mostly a matter of focus. You used that word earlier. Also, I knew that we didn't have a big budget, and there were some things in the book that just would never be able to film. But also, I thought there was a story there that wasn't fully carried out in the book, and that was very filmic, and it turned out beautifully. I just got a nice residual check.
No, and it must be a good feeling to really like how it's executed.
And the director respected the material as much as I did, and did an incredible job on a very tight budget. It was a Hallmark, but was not one of the biggies, and so they didn't have a lot of money.
Are there specific writers who have influenced you tremendously?
Well, I don't think you could work I couldn't work in my field and not be influenced by Patty Chayefsky and Rod Serling and Larry Gelbart in comedy. It was too late for me to be influenced by Seinfeld.
I think you'll be okay.
In the non on the non TV side, I think all those writers that I read in the Logansport Public Library, they Chekhov and Ibsen and Philip Barry and Robert Sherwood and Maxwell Anderson, certainly they had an influence on me. In humor, I think I was very much influenced by Robert Benchley and James Thurber. And John Cheever, I have a great admiration for John Cheever and the understated, which has sometimes worked to my detriment. I understate to the place where the important people don't get it. And that's to be avoided.
Well, the hard part is the viewers would get it if they would just
Yeah,
let it go.
Right.
But
yeah, the whole echelon that says you've got to make this more understandable, you've got to spell it out. It's something you have to fight all the time and try to find a balance. You're not going to get it made if you don't do some compromising, unfortunately.
John, how would you define structure?
Well, that's a big one. But I was told something very early in my career, and this is a great oversimplification, but if you keep it in mind, it's very helpful. I was told when I was writing plays for the theater more, but it applies to television and screen too. Structure is, in the first part, you get your protagonist chased up a tree. In the second part, you throw rocks at him. And in the third part, you get him down. And essentially, if you can bring that off with suitable subtlety, that's, to me, is structure. And I've been told that I'm a very good structuralist. I think a lot of it is instinct. I mean, you just feel you've got to build to a crescendo and then diminuendo away, and then you build to another one, and then hopefully you build to the biggest one and resolve it.
It seems to me in episodic television you're doing that in half an hour. Is that something?
Half an hour was one of the biggest, particularly, not so much comedy. Comedy, usually you were dealing with a very small idea and you didn't have too many characters to develop, and they were pretty well developed because it was a series and people were familiar with them. But to do dramatic shows in half an hour, I think I did a lot of GE theater half hour, and it's tough to get any feeling of character, particularly if you're hampered with a lot of story, which you were, because most producers and networks were suspicious of character pieces unless there was a story there they could get hold of, A, B, C, D. They didn't want to do it. And they're just, in 22 minutes, you have to establish at least a couple of characters and do the up the tree and stones and down the tree. It's a tough, tough medium. An hour, going to an hour was such a marvelous relief. And then, of course, when I got into long form, I was in heaven to have 2 hours to do that, or
now,
96 minutes.
With somebody like Thomas Jefferson, I mean, is that, obviously, you can't go from 6 hours to 2 hours. I mean, it's like a Ken Burns.
Yeah.
You know, that's a formula that does not work.
He had such Jefferson had such an enormously full life that in 2 hours, and we're talking about 92 minutes now, you couldn't begin. You could do an episode. You could do a particular part of his life, I think. But we were trying to do the man, and 2 terms as president, 2 very difficult terms. What Merchant Ivory threw away, the years in Paris, that is a good movie in itself. They just didn't happen to make it, in my opinion.
When you write, do you outline and?
I'm an outliner, but I'm not, I think the great danger there is being totally married to an outline. I think an outline for me is a great kickoff place. And I feel it's a security blanket. You know, I'm not going into this wilderness completely unaided. I've got this to lean on. But then the longer I've worked at it, the more I've worked at it, I've become freer and freer to say, hey, this looked good in the outline, you know, Act 1, Scene 4, but it just doesn't work here. Now that I'm getting to know my characters, and they're telling me, ooh, we don't want this scene, you know, we don't need this scene. Cut to the chase here. So I'm not tied to an outline, but I do find it helpful just in getting started. No matter whether you're writing comedy or drama or melodrama or westerns or what have you, for me, character is it. Yeah, you've got to have a story. The character has to be in jeopardy in one way or another, but you've got to have the character first. And if you have the character, or he has you, or she has you, I've been told I write very well for women. If she has you, then you listen to her. And when she says a line, you know it's not that you've given her. You know it doesn't sound right.
What are some of your favorite characters you've developed or you've created?
Oh, well, again, that's a hard question because some of the best things, I think, I didn't really create them. I created my impression of them. I think Helen Keller and Teacher certainly are right up there. Judge Horton and the Scottsboro Boys. And I had very little to work from there. I knew a lot about the boys, but there really was very little available on this wonderful man who risked his career and lost it by taking a stand. I loved working with both Patty Duke and Annette. I mean, Annette is such an incredible woman, so brave. Another one of the ones I did that didn't get made, Mother Teresa. That was the year when they did 3 movies of the week based on that Babysitter back in New Jersey or wherever. Each network did one, and they could not find 2 hours for a story about Mother Teresa.
Well, you know, and just when she died, look at the coverage on Princess Diana as opposed to Mother Teresa. I mean,
and I was so lucky. You know, I went to India and spent 2 weeks with her in the place, in the hospice that she runs for the dying, and remarkable woman. I've toyed with the idea, I'll probably never get it done, but I've toyed with the idea of writing a book called But Let a Woman in Your Life, because the women that I've written about have really changed my life and my attitudes. You know, I mentioned a few of them, Helen Keller and Mother Teresa, and so yes, I've been very, very fortunate. I got to meet my idol of all time, Bette Davis, and sit on a love seat with her in the Pierre Hotel in New York City and talk and have her tell me what a great script I'd written and hear her. She had agreed, this was Amy Semple McPherson, and she was playing Amy's mother. She had many years before tried to get Jack Warner to let her do Amy when she was on the lot, but she was playing the mother because she thought Anne Margaret was going to do Amy. And then that was not too long after Anne Margaret fell in Vegas, and she just was scared of it and backed off. So they got Faye Dunaway. And in the Pierre Hotel, I'm sitting talking to Miss Davis, and Faye sweeps in. And she is putting everybody down and in their place. And at one point says, she's talking about scripts and who approves them and who doesn't and how you get things done. And she says, turns to Miss Davis and says, I'm sure it was very different in your day, dear. And Miss Davis took a moment and said, darling, this is my day. They had a great love-hate relationship for 4 weeks, I'll tell you.
That's good. That's good. Do you have particular actors in mind when you are writing?
I often do. I have some of my best friends are actors. I learned in series television almost never to mention who I had in mind. I might use them in my own mind to develop the character, but if I had the temerity to suggest in the script this would be a so-and-so type, that was almost insurance that they wouldn't get the role. I find it very helpful to think in terms of specific actors, and I think this grows out of the old radio days. When I worked with a kind of stock company, I mentioned earlier that I wrote a radio series for Arizona called Arizona Adventures, and I had a stock company of about 6 people, 7 people, and I used them week after week, and I knew what they could do, what they were best at, and I found it very helpful. And so when I transferred to television, I would very often think of, gee, I can see Susan Hayward in this, or whoever. And but I rarely suggested it, because a couple of times I did. I remember putting in a script once a Walter Catlett type, and the casting director was outraged. Is this writer trying to do my job? I'll decide who plays this role. So I guess I'm answering yes and no. I've used it for my own purposes, but I don't usually. Sometimes I'm asked, actually sometimes a producer will say, do you have anybody, would you recommend anybody? For instance, on the Roy Rogers piece that I've been working on most of my life, they said, do you have any suggestions? And I said, the actor who plays the Mountie in Going South, it was on CBS for a while, and it's made in Canada, and he's got that wholesome, naive, but don't you believe it for a minute look that Roy Rogers needs, I think.
But what a concept to ask the writer.
Yes.
Who do you see in this part?
Well, this is Gil Cates and Dennis Doty, with whom I've worked happily several times, and we work as a team.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that writers aren't asked that more, but it's obviously an ego/job security situation.
We have a casting director.
Don't need another one. What's the difference between good dialogue and just talk?
Good dialogue is just talk edited, I think. Just talk hopefully means to communicate, which is very worthwhile. Good dialogue should communicate one person to another, also to that unseen person who is watching it. It should, without being obvious and expository, it should be moving the story forward. Hopefully it should be telling you a little something new about the character in the way he or she expresses himself. And in the best of all possible worlds, it should be interesting in itself. So, and usually just talk doesn't qualify. In working with some of the writer-producers I have, I've learned that my dialogue is pretty good, but I do have a tendency to say more than is necessary. And some cleverness may be clever, but it doesn't necessarily advance the story or tell you anything new about the character. And so unhappily, some of my cleverest things have gotten the axe.
It must be difficult to look at a line and say, that is the greatest line, but it doesn't.
It just doesn't. We don't need it here. Put it away, and maybe at some future date you'll have a script where it fits better. But overwriting was one of my biggest problems. But I finally now actually turn in a 105-page script, which is pretty good. I used to be closer to 120, which is not so good. I find sometimes when I'm forcing to write a scene, when a scene just isn't coming, that if I just say, okay, I'll put that aside and write a limerick or make an entry in my journal or whatever, and just get my mind completely away from the problem. Sometimes I can then go back and say, oh yeah, why didn't I see that? Also frequently, if you're forcing, say, okay, even though it is only 3:30, I'm sacking it in for the day. And I find the subconscious is a wonderful co-writer, my favorite kind of co-writer. And I don't say that I dream the answers, but I put the problem in my mind and go to sleep, and very often in the morning I've got an answer. It may not be a great answer, but it's an answer.
And it probably gets you on to the next thing.
That's right, which is what we want to do, is keep moving here.
What do you think of the pitch process nowadays?
Well, when I first was introduced to it, I thought, I can't do this. It's not my thing. I'm a writer. Let me go write and you read it, and if you like it, fine. If you don't, okay, I'll write something else. But I quickly realized that that's not the way it works out here. The pitch is very important, and I've been told that I do a very good pitch. And I wish that there weren't so much of it, and I wish there weren't so many people involved in the pitches. It's so diluted. I mean, it's trying to appease and compromise with a committee. It's bad enough to appease and compromise with an individual who has tastes which are similar or dissimilar from yours, but if there are 6 people in the room, all of whom you're looking at and think which one really has the right to decide on this, it's very distracting and leads to too much compromise, I think.
I think too, for a lot of writers, they may pitch well on paper. They could, but to go in person, and I think some writers, now because I think, see, it doesn't surprise me that you pitch well because you're a storyteller. And even there's a difference though, don't you think, between a writer and a storyteller?
Absolutely. And I, as I say, when I first came out here, I thought this is the most unfair thing I ever heard of, that I'm not to be judged by what I write, but by what I say. But I have a very wise agent, and she said, I'm sorry, Johnny, but that's the way it works. I have to tell a John Gay story here. To go back to what we were talking about a minute ago, he went to pitch to a 26-year-old executive and his entourage. There's usually an entourage as well as the 26-year-old. And they settled themselves, and coffee was offered and bottled water, and then the 26-year-old leaned back in his chair and said, so tell me what you've done. And John listened, sat for a moment and said, you first. He did not get the assignment. In the days when I was working in episodic and at the heyday of doing the movies for TV, my favorite time of day started at 5 o'clock. And I got into that primarily because we had little kids. And it was a very quiet time, those 2.5 hours. And I was working at home. Also, I found when we moved out here that if I started early, it was before the phone started to ring. And by 10 or 10:30, when I began to get various forms of harassment, I had done a pretty good day's work, actually. And as I say, I frequently worked then till 5 in the afternoon. So I was putting in 12-hour days a lot of the time. At first, we improvised a place for me, which was not too effective, given the coming and going of little feet. And then finally, when we began to be a little more prosperous, we added a room over the garage for me, a studio, which was great. And that room was marvelous. And then when we moved to Laguna, where we live now, we couldn't add a room, but we converted a room into a study office for me, which I can completely shut off. and keep the grandchildren out. From about 1962 on, the years when we first came out, I didn't have that luxury. But I've had a kind of private place ever since 1962. And I love my wife, but she also, it isn't only the children. She's pretty well trained, but when something is pressing, she still comes in, and I'm on the boat with Kipling's boys, and she's worried about maintenance in the building, you know. But that's part of it. When I'm really into something, I may not be sitting in my office or using the word processor, but I don't really participate in the so-called real world. I come out and make small talk and eat and sleep. My wife would be in a better position to tell you about this. But she's wonderfully understanding, always has been. And the other world that you're creating for a while becomes more real if it's going good. If it's going good, it becomes more real than all this other stuff out there. A question that has been asked is, what do you need? And I need a pencil and a pad of paper. I write everything in not everything, I write all the dialogue in longhand first. I fell into that because at a critical moment I had to have surgery. We had just sold a series called Black Saddle, and we were going on in January, and we didn't have any shows in the can, and I was co-creator and story editor and all that good stuff, and suddenly I had passed a kidney stone, and they found a growth, and I was in the hospital, and no scripts, and I couldn't sit up at a typewriter for about a month. So I said to my wife, bring me one of those clipboards and some paper. And I thought, hey, I like this because it's not permanent. There's a sense of impermanence. You can change it. There was a lot of, particularly when you had to type it, there was a lot of, oh, I've got it there and it's pretty looking, and please don't ask me to change it. But if you scrawled something and you say, oh no, that's not right, you just cross it out and try it again and try it again. Ever since then, that was 1958, I've written everything, all the dialogue in longhand. And I make notes to myself about any descriptions, scene descriptions and that sort of thing, but I don't do them in full until, in the old days, I used to do it on the typewriter, and then now I do it on a word processor. But that pencil and pad are the important thing. I've worked long enough to know that there are certain boundaries you should respect. And when I first started and didn't know much about the business or film, I would be very specific. You know, I did all the little minute shots, medium shot, close-up, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, none of them were ever used. And so now, mostly I just write master scenes. And if there is something that I think even a bright, intelligent, and creative director might miss, I might say in for close-up of so-and-so because it's going to be very important later on. But generally, I write master scenes. One of the questions that's been asked, did you ever suffer from writer's block? I never did. I wrote a bunch of stuff that I didn't like the next day and changed it, but I could always write. Because I just said, this is your job, and get on with it. And I think that ties back to what I said earlier about the pencil and the pad. You're not chipping it into stone. It can very easily be erased. Do it and then criticize it. Don't criticize it before you put it on the page, or you'll never put it on the page. I've talked to so many would-be writers who flatteringly say, I would write this myself if I had the time, but I thought you maybe could do it for me. But they want it to be perfectly formed in their heads before they ever put it on the page, and so it never gets set down at all. And Maybe Shakespeare was able to just put it down right the first time, but that I think is something that I feel a professional writer has to accept, that you don't just write, you rewrite and you rewrite and you rewrite. And it would be lovely, and it's happened maybe once or twice when they say, we're going to shoot the first draft. But it's usually because they don't have time to ask you to rewrite.
And it's certainly the exception to the rule.
Yes.
Now, when you write, do you know that something's going to be, I don't want to say a hit, but more saleable, or do you know that it's going to be one of the best things you've done as you're writing it?
Sometimes I have that feeling, and very falsely, because I think that the Jefferson script, if it could be done in its full 6 hours, is one of the very best things I've ever written. And Merchant Ivory blew us out of the water by making that perfectly dreadful film about Jefferson. And so everybody said, oh no, we've seen that, forget Jefferson. And it's, well, the material is so rich, and he was such an exceptional, and I spent a year with him, and I don't know him. He's a very intriguing and endlessly mysterious kind of person. I thought we'd get it made. I really did, because it just felt good to me. Another thing that I really am very, very proud of, and you say, where do you get your ideas? Two people said to me, would you be interested in doing a piece about the Mona Lisa? And I said, what do you mean, a piece about the Mona Lisa? Do you mean stealing the Mona Lisa or what? No, who was the Mona Lisa? And what was the relationship with Leonardo? And I said, yeah. And I really got into the research and did a miniseries for NBC. And they were very excited about it. We had a director. We had a start date. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum. They had a disaster, Ernest Hemingway piece, the one about the bullfighting. I can't remember the name.
Death in the Afternoon?
Yeah. They put it on and nobody watched it. And Brandon Tartikoff called everybody Monday morning and said, no more costume pieces. No more, period.
It couldn't be possibly that it was about bullfighting that people didn't want to watch it.
Didn't matter. So Joe Sargent, who was going to direct it, was out of a job, and Ann Weston and Marcy Gross are the two people who asked me if I would like to do a piece of it. They've never given it up. They have gotten financing in Europe for it, but they've never been able to match it with somebody in the United States, and you've got to have a U.S. Distributor or buyer. So
frustration.
Yes.
How long does it usually, and I don't know if you can say this for one project, but how long does it usually take you from first draft to completion?
Me or me and the network?
Well, let's say you, because we're really complicated if we talk about the network.
Yeah. For a 2-hour piece, 6 weeks to 2 months. I'm satisfied. Then, of course, it really sets in, and you usually end up, by the time you've satisfied the producers and everybody, and then go to the networks. Now, I've been working on the story of Roy Rogers for more than a year now, and I was happy with the first draft. In fact, we've gone back to most of it, but because of the situation of the networks, stall, and we lose our liaison person who goes off to work for Disney instead, and a new person comes in and says, well, this is very interesting, and I'm the last to come in and change somebody else's work, but don't you think that if the emphasis were transferred to, sure, Michael, whatever you say, if you just give us a go-ahead on this film.
You give me a start date and we'll change that scene.
But I'd say that my work is about anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 months on a 2-hour film.
Now, how do you do your research?
For a long time, my wife was my researcher. Hey, that's a title, huh? But she's had eye problems, and she used to do all the basic stuff. You know, go through a book and mark, or several books, and mark what she felt would be useful, helpful to me. I have worked with professional researchers, particularly on projects that are legally sensitive. And then I've done, on Jefferson, I did all the research myself. I've got a whole Jefferson library now. I've got one of those whirl-around book stands, and it's nothing but Jefferson. Marked, all suitably marked, you know.
What are the most important mistakes you've learned from?
I've made a mistake? I'm shocked.
Let's say perceived mistakes from somebody
Well,
else's.
I think the biggest mistake I made was denying that my real gift lay in writing some form of theater. I wasted a lot of time and energy early in my life trying to sell the New Yorker, trying to be a novelist, and finally a wonderful friend at KTAR, announcer writer, said, "John, why don't you do what you do best? You know, why? You're not a New Yorker writer, obviously, since you have a trunk full of rejections from them, but you write wonderful radio plays." We were doing a series of radio plays then that I'd written in Phoenix. And that's how I made my first sale. He said, if you would take that Christmas play that we did on the radio and spend an hour or two putting it on so that it could be staged, I'll bet you'd sell it. And he was right. I did. So it's finding your groove and not denying it. I mean, there was a lot of snobism in that. I want to be a New Yorker writer, you know, and radio is somehow not, or even the theater at that point I was thinking was not intellectual enough. Other mistakes, being too trusting.
Really?
Although I don't really mean that. My agent, Sylvia Hirsch, God love her, said to me once when somebody had taken advantage of me, "The trouble with you, Johnny, is you're just too nice." And I said, "Yeah, I guess that's why I never made it." But you can be badly burned if you are too naive and too trusting. It's a business, and you know, it's wonderful to be idealistic about it, and I don't want to ever lose that, the idealism. But it's also a business, and
well, there's a fine line, I think, between being naive and being a humanitarian,
yeah,
and knowing where your craft lies there.
Well, it's that balance again that I mentioned before. It's finding that balance between being aware and not losing what made you be a writer in the first place.
I guess yourself, really.
Yeah, right.
How would you define success?
Ooh-wee. You asked some hard questions. I think, selfishly, that success is being happy with yourself and what you've done. I think the other, you get, if you're lucky, you get a lot of other accolades along the way. But if you're really pleased, in the long run, of course you have regrets and wish you'd done certain things differently, or wish you'd had this assignment or that assignment. But if in the balance, you feel good about what you've done, proud of what you've done, that's success.
It must make you proud too to think of what your parents. We all, I don't care. I think everybody wants to please their parents, but don't you think that that's as
Sure, the family has been very important in my life, and not only my parents, but my children, I think, are pleased with the kind of life that I've led and the things that I've done, and that's important to me. And my wife, most of all, of course.
Do you consider yourself a role model for other writers?
I think it's hard to have for me, to have a role model. I mean, you can learn, and you can take this and take that, and respect this and that, but you've got to individually, I mean, I think the writer has to be his own individual if he's really going to be pleased with what he does and have my definition of success.
Do you think the mentoring process, now that Hollywood is the way it is with the pitching and everything else, is mentoring other writers important?
I think so. I would like, I wish I were more involved with. I have, just on my own, worked with some young writers, and I found it very rewarding. For just a semester, our younger daughter, went to Pitzer, and the Pitzer people, the college was very new in those days, and they asked me if I would offer a course in screenwriting, and I did, and I wanted to limit it to 15. 200 signed up, and I said, I hate to be cruel, but it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't be any good for any of us. So I ended up with 18, and working with them was very gratifying to me. And out of the 18, half a dozen really, I think, grew, and some of them are doing very well. They all wrote a script, and I made them do the whole thing, from pitching it to outline to et cetera, et cetera. And then I submitted the scripts to MASH. That was a high MASH time, and 6 out of the 18 wrote MASH scripts. And I sent them over, and they wrote very nice letters to the kids, encouraging them.
How exciting to have that kind of interaction for them.
Well, I brought somebody every week. I brought a network executive, I brought an agent, et cetera. And that was one reason the kids said that they wanted so desperately to be in the class, because they said that they hadn't had anything practical, that they'd learned a lot at Pitzer and so forth.
But writing, too, is not out of a book,
No,
so.
you got to write. Rejection is going to be part of your life. Learn to accept it, not let it destroy you. Take it for what it's worth. Sometimes rejection can give you clues to what you're not doing that you should be doing. Sometimes it can't give you any clue, but get on with it and find the security in yourself, which people are going to tell you writers will, if you're going to be a writer, you'll have no security. Well, you'll have security if you find it in your belief in yourself, I think. And don't, unless you want it, don't allow yourself to be pigeonholed. It's a very comfortable thing, unless there's a change, and there always is a change, and suddenly nobody wants a Western writer, or nobody wants a suspense writer. And if you have options, I think it keeps you fresher as a writer to try new things, even if you're not as good at that as you are at something else. So give yourself as many options as possible. I've realized that when we were talking about my philosophy and what tips I would have, that I brought a little thing that I took off the screen of my word processor, because I keep it right up there in front of me usually. And it's a quotation which I think sums up pretty much what I've tried to ramble on and say. It's a quotation from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. My French is non-existent, but he wrote The Little Prince. And the quote is, "Perfection is finally attained, not when there is no longer anything to add, but when there is no longer anything to take away." And I'm for that.